Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. In November, the world came together in Glasgow to look for solutions to the global climate crisis. So, 1 month on this week, we'll consider the true legacy of the COP26 summit. Delayed a year by the pandemic, COP26 finally took place in Glasgow in November. World leaders and tens of thousands of delegates came together to tackle the looming climate crisis. Decisions, albeit perhaps a little watered down, were made to try and keep the world to the promised 1.5 degree rise in global temperatures. And many initiatives were launched, including the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, a coalition of governments designed to oversee the phasing out of fossil fuels. One of its chairs is Dan Jørgensen, Denmark's Minister of Climate, Energy and Public Utilities. Minister, we spoke to Andrea Meza Murillo before COP26 about how Costa Rica and Denmark are working together to create this Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which was launched, in fact, at COP26, wasn't it, in Glasgow? What's the thinking behind it from your perspective, from a Danish perspective?
Well, we know from the science that if we are to keep temperature increases below 1.5 degrees, then we need to leave a lot of the oil and gas that's in the ground, leave it there, probably around 60% of it. So that must be the starting point for any discussion on an energy future for the planet. Now, in Denmark, we have taken the consequence of that, and we have decided to phase out our own oil and gas production so that we will end it completely in 2050. And already now we have canceled all future licensing rounds. So we're hoping that other countries will follow our example.
What happened at COP26, Minister? Did you get a lot of support?
We were able to get support from 10 other governments or subnational governments. So we are 11 countries all in all. Some of them, like for instance, Quebec and Greenland and New Zealand, are either big producers or have very big reserves. Also, a huge economy like California. So we are a good group of countries that now support this important message. Obviously, it's far from enough. We need more countries, and we need the larger producers also to make the same decisions as we've made.
Well, and that's a very important point, because you signed up some of the, should we say, smaller ones. You didn't sign up any of the big ones, did you? The UK, to name but one. Well, but do you think?
I think to be fair, you are talking to a Dane, and I've just asked the population in my country to say no to well, basically money that we could take up of the ground, that is oil and gas. And it was a quite expensive decision for our country. We were actually the biggest oil producer in the EU when we made the decision. And look at a country like Greenland. They have reserves that are huge. I think that the reserves in Greenland, I read somewhere that they could actually fulfill the entire oil demand of the planet as it is right now for 9 months. So it's not a small matter for the country engaged. Now, having said that, you are of course right that there are still some very big producers on the planet that, if we are to stay below 1.5 degrees, also need to look into a future where they are also phasing out their production.
And what can you say to the other big producers to get them on board in future, do you think? And I do acknowledge the fact it must have been a hard economic sell for you in Denmark.
It is a hard economic sale, and it is obviously also extra hard for countries that have very, very big earnings on oil and gas. On the other hand, if you look at where international energy policy is moving right now, it's clear that investments in renewables are becoming cheaper and cheaper. It's clear that decisions that are being made in national governments, but also in the EU, for instance, the decision just put forward by the European Commission to propose that We ban all new internal combustion engine cars from 2035. All of these decisions point in one direction, which is a fossil-free future. And if you think about it, most countries now have decided that they want to be net zero countries in 2050, which is great because that's what we need. But does it really make sense to say on one hand that you want to be net zero, but on the other hand that you want to continue selling oil and gas to others? I don't think it does. So I think these countries, even though I acknowledge it's a difficult decision for them, need to start having that conversation with themselves and their citizens.
Yeah, they're trying to achieve some kind of green compromise, aren't they? And is that what COP26 finished as, a sort of compromise, do you think, or was a lot achieved?
It's always a compromise. Just think about it. If you have to agree with 10 or 20 of your friends what to have for lunch, that can be a difficult negotiation. Then imagine having 197 friends, and imagine that those friends were not friends but countries with internal interests and internal negotiations also. It is extremely difficult. So when you think about it, actually, I think the progress that was made in Glasgow was quite significant. And the point, for instance, that it's now mentioned in the text for the first time ever at a COP meeting that we need to phase down coal and we need to phase out insufficient fossil fuels subsidies. That's huge progress. Also, the doubling of climate adaptation aid to the poorest countries in the world. Those are some of the very positive things that came out of the COP. I think it's fair to say after the COP that we still have a chance of keeping the temperature increase below 1.5 degrees. Had we not made the decisions that we did, then that chance would probably have been gone. Now, of course, there's still a lot to do. We still aren't even close to where we need to be, but things are moving in the right direction.
Final communiques, pledges, promises, great press, great headlines for that day, that week. How do you make sure that they fulfill those pledges and live up to the promises? Should there be some kind of financial penalty, do you think?
I think that in the perfect world, we would have a system with transparency and sanctions. But we also need to acknowledge that the United Nations, they don't have the ability to put sanctions like that on a country. And I think probably also, even in my own country, I would get some problems with the constituency and our constitution if we were to allow that. So that's probably not the way to go. Having said that, when we do look at the agreements made in the COP process, we do actually, when we use the strongest language available to us and countries commit to that, have a pretty good track record of also having countries fulfill what they promise. The problem is when the language is too vague, when it's possible for countries to get away with not doing anything. I think, though, that we are looking into a future where there's going to be a lot of momentum and a lot of pressure, meaning that countries that are not in line with the Paris Agreement will be named and shamed. And it'll be obvious for everybody who is doing enough and who isn't. And I think that that also matters in international politics.
Denmark, of course, created the world's first offshore wind farm, didn't you? It's now pushing ahead to create the world's first so-called energy islands. Can you tell us a little more about what exactly they are?
Yes, well, instead of having one offshore wind farm that you then connect to the shore of one country with a cable, we now build an artificial island in the North Sea, 80 kilometers from the sea, the size of more than 260 football fields. It'll be the biggest infrastructure investment in our country's history. So that island will then be the hub, and you will have hundreds of wind turbines equaling many offshore wind farms around the island. It'll then connect to several countries. So we will then collaborate with hopefully Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, and other countries so that they can also benefit from the forces of nature, the resources that is the wind in the North Sea.
If the force of nature isn't blowing, what happens then?
Well, first of all, what we hope to achieve with this is that you'll get so much energy from this this new island that you will have enough for when you need it. That's the first problem. The
Storage is another big problem.
The second problem is then, of course, okay, so what happens when the wind is not blowing? And there it's important to, first of all, have an integrated European system where you can then use other sources for when that's not happening, but also connecting this to what we call Power to X. So that's basically electrolyzers that transform the electricity into first hydrogen, and then you can either utilize the hydrogen or you can make that into liquid fuels that can be put on ships and planes or heavy transport. So that will solve two problems. One, how do we use renewables in the parts of our energy systems where we can today? And two, how do we store the energy for when we need it?
There have been some questions raised, Minister, about whether or not these islands will be or are financially viable. You've basically said they'll produce cheaper power, but are they financially viable?
They will be. We have a lot of interest from private investors also, and even though some companies are also idealistic, I do acknowledge that. I think it's fair to assume that when we ask them to invest very, very big amounts of money, which we're talking about here, they wouldn't do it if they didn't also believe that this will be a good business case. Now, does it come with a cost to be a front runner and the first country in the world to do this? It probably does. But you know what? That's actually also what we hope. We want to be leaders so that others can follow the example and thereby maybe not necessarily do the same mistakes as we will probably do when we do something for the first time. Look at the first offshore wind farm we built back in 1991. That was quite small and pretty expensive and not very efficient compared to what we have today. But had we not done that, then we wouldn't have been in the situation where we are now, because somebody needs to take the first steps.
So what kind of reaction do you expect to this at COP27 in Egypt? What do you want from Egypt in COP27, in other words?
Well, what we did in Glasgow was to say that already next year in Egypt, countries need to revise their NDCs. That is the pledges that they've put forward on how much they will reduce their emissions. And that is necessary because right now we're on the track of a temperature increase of 2.7 degrees, which is, of course, far above where we need to be. So the countries that hasn't yet submitted their pledges need to do so. And the countries that hasn't submitted pledges that are strong enough and ambitious enough need to revise them. And that is really the pressure that we need to keep on the parties, that is the countries, from now and until the meeting next year. We've actually already begun those conversations. So this process is an ongoing one, and it's not only a meeting a couple of weeks a year. It's a discussion that takes place all 12 months of the year.
You sound very positive and you sound very optimistic, which is obviously a good thing, and if you're not, then nobody would be. But how positive and optimistic are you about the climate future?
Well, no, there's many reasons for me to be pessimist. I mean, people often ask me, are you able to sleep at night? And I usually say, well, yeah, I sleep like a baby. I sleep for a few hours, then I wake up and cry for a little bit, and then I sleep for, far from where we need to be. And every time we get a new scientific report, it shows us that it's probably worse than we even thought. On the other hand, I have to say we're moving faster in the right direction than we ever had. The result in Glasgow is one example, but also if you look at the European Union, now it's not only countries like Denmark that are moving, others are also really doing it. And the European Union as a whole, we've decided to reduce our emissions by 55% in 2030. Just a few years ago, that would have been impossible. The proposal to ban new internal combustion engine cars, I mean, this is proposed by a commission that has a German commissioner, a French commissioner, an Italian commissioner, a Polish, car-producing countries are proposing this. So a lot of things are going in the right direction. The US has re-entered the Paris Agreement. India has pledged 500 gigawatts of renewables. China said that they will stop financing coal plants abroad. So we need to, of course, try and see all of the positive things that are happening and use them as a leverage to do even more. I think that's much more persuasive than just using a narrative of how bad everything is going and how terrible it will be if we don't do this. Just one final quote for you, or something to think about. Martin Luther King, he didn't start a civil rights movement and revolution by giving a speech that was called "I Have a Nightmare."
Dan Jørgensen, Minister of Climate, Energy and Public Utilities, many thanks for joining us here on The Agenda.
Thank you.
Still to come here on The Agenda, another take on the climate legacy of COP26. We'll be speaking to Italy's Minister for Ecological Transition, Roberto Chingalani. Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to The Agenda. Before the break, we heard from Denmark's climate minister and got his thoughts on the outcome of COP26. But now let's travel a little further south to one of Europe's largest economies, Italy. The man in charge of tackling climate change there is Roberto Chingalani, Italy's Minister for Ecological Transition, and he joins me now from Rome. Roberto, can I just take your immediate response to what was achieved or what wasn't at COP26?
Having said that I'm a technical minister, I'm not a politician, by education, I believe expectations should be proportional to difficulty. So gathering 190...
That's a very political answer. Well, perhaps more of a diplomatic answer.
I'm going into the numbers, believe me. Gathering 195 countries around the table with very different instances and problems, the definition itself of the ecological transition is different whether you're in Europe or you're in Central Africa. I believe that what we got is the reasonable compromise, but this compromise could not be that strong in the end of the day. So let's say the good points are that everybody agreed that we have to keep the acceleration towards 1.5 centigrades alive. This half degree decrease in the global target it means a lot. It means that in certain areas of the planet, we will keep maybe 3 degrees less in the next 30 years. The second point is that there was some step forward in terms of transparency and the rules for the future management of the finances. Okay, to be honest, I understood that this was the best that could have been done. But in general, if I stay in the socks of the vulnerable countries, I am sure that they are not satisfied. We didn't succeed in getting the 100 billion contribution. We didn't succeed in mobilizing more money. There is a general statement about the fact that we have to increase our effort as advanced countries. But, well, facts should follow the statements and the rules. And finally, I think some important differences emerged in the comparison, in the discussion. And I understand the instances of China, of India, and other big countries having a fossil fuel manufacturing that is more recent than the one we had in Europe, for instance. So there is a different need of time for different countries. This is very difficult to combine, I understand, but I also understand that it's a realistic problem. We have to face it, and we have to discuss how to make it in the future.
You've mentioned China and India, and as you know, the big issue was fossil fuels, especially coal. Although the language was watered down, this was the first COP, I think, to make specific decisions on coal and fossil fuels. So would you say that was at least something of a breakthrough?
Sure. I'm a physicist. What is important is not the instantaneous speed, but it's the average speed. we all agreed that we have to go to 1.5 by, let's say, mid-century, even though the date is not yet fixed, but around mid-century. That means that we can achieve this result with different speeds. Maybe somebody will be slower at the beginning, somebody will be faster. Italy can be faster because we have already a background in decarbonization. Some other countries, especially the very big countries, might need more time at the very beginning. But what is important is that we land at 1.5 in due time altogether. So I want to see the half glass full, and I think it's very important that everybody agreed on 1.5. And even though we had to smooth a little bit from phase out to phase down, I'm confident that we all agree that by the mid-century, around mid-century, we have to be at 1.5. So what is important is the pathway to reach 1.5, not what happens exactly tomorrow, but what we do during the pathway. And I want to be optimistic, and I think that everybody wants to be at 1.5 at the right time.
The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, admitted that this final approved text were a compromise. Was a compromise somehow always inevitable? Certainly on these big set-piece events, it invariably ends in compromise, doesn't it?
Yeah. Look, I believe that the compromise was needed. I mean, imagine the opposite. We don't agree because we don't agree on a specific issue, and then we don't reach a global agreement. So what would have happened the day after? Everybody going on his own? That would have been a disaster. We need a unified world in this respect. We might step a little bit down on the date or on the language, but we should be all on the same, all on board when we say 1.5 by mid-century. And I'm sure that technology would provide us with new solutions in the next 10, 12 years, so that it will be even easier to accomplish the 1.5 in due time. And let's keep the good part. We needed to be all on board. It would have been not acceptable to split in such an important moment.
I mean, you're talking about solidarity, and you've said that you don't think the world has really seen the importance of solidarity to fight climate change. How can you help change that? How can you help rectify that?
Yeah, honestly, I was not at all happy in realizing that we were not able to accomplish the 100 billion target, you know, the financial aid for the vulnerable countries promised in 2015, and after 6 years not yet accomplished. Okay, there was the COVID in the middle that didn't make things easier. But anyway, this was not a good excuse. So this I didn't like at all. And the second thing that worries me a little bit is that when we talk about finance, green finance, I think we should clarify there is a very ethical finance that we should develop, but finance can also be getting rich out of the carbon market, for instance. I don't think this at the moment is good. At the moment, we really have to diminish global inequalities. So solidarity and green finance and ethical finance is very necessary. So my first point is vulnerable, rich countries should support vulnerable countries as soon as possible with 100 billions. It's not acceptable that we were not able to collect 100 billions. The 100 billions from the public should leverage much more money from the private through public-private partnerships. And it's impossible to reach the needed trillion range if the private will not cooperate with the public. So in this respect, it is very important that what the public, the states are doing will be perceived as the start, as a spark to gather more money for fundraising, because we need a lot more money to reduce global inequalities. We cannot separate global inequalities by climate change. I mean, I hope this is clear to everybody.
There were some agreements, as you know, like the rules for a carbon market that was made at COP26. But the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said afterwards, we can encourage, but we cannot force sovereign nations to do what they don't want to do. And that's a big problem, isn't it?
Well, in some sense, national sovereignty, as a matter of fact, we have to respect the decisions. But I think one of the good points of the COP is that all countries were sitting around the table, and in the end of the day, we shared a global common objective, which is an umbrella objective. Now, within this umbrella objective, Of course, we have to coexist with the national sovereignty, but if we all agreed about the decarbonization in order to be mid-century at 1.5 degrees temperature increase, well, in different ways, but we all have to go there. So I think that we should distinguish. Respecting national sovereignty is, of course, compulsory, but on the other hand, all nations, all countries got some commitment. So we should see, we should accept the fact that all countries have accepted the common shared target. So the two things can coexist.
Looking forward to Egypt and COP27. I know we've only just finished COP26. Are you at all hopeful that a lot more can or will have been achieved by the time the great and the good meet in Egypt for COP27?
Okay, I'll be very straight. We made the rules, we made the transparency, we made all the legal frame. How to say, the box, the container is perfect. Now I want to see the content. So in Egypt, there will be no more excuse. There must be the content into the container. So we have the rules, and we need now the money and the actions onto which we apply the rules. So we have 1 year time to go from the legal frame, from the rules and transparency and language into the actions. It's another challenge. It's a challenge in the challenge.
Roberto Chingalani, many thanks to you for joining us on The Agenda.
Thank you.
Everyone at COP26 was very well aware the stakes were high, and there was an optimistic start. The US and EU agreed to cut emissions of methane, that's a powerful greenhouse gas, by 30% by 2030. Then leaders from countries that are home to 85% of the world's forests pledged to end and reverse deforestation in the same year. And more than 40 countries signed up to a plan to coordinate the introduction of clean technologies. But the reality was that very few expected COP26 to deliver the scale of change necessary to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, a vital step, as Roberto Chingalani told me. The COVID crisis has shown that governments can act quickly and deploy huge resources when they need to, but the jury is out on whether or not the politicians will deliver on those targets and whether holding temperature rises to 1.5 is sufficient because of the amount of greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere. In my view, the United Nations should create a system for verifying that countries are in fact fulfilling their promises. The lesson of previous climate summits is that what follows on from them is more important than the exact wording of the final communique. I suspect it'll be economics as much as environmental concerns that determine the pace of change. A huge amount of money is being directed towards green technology. Public awareness and concern about climate change has grown considerably in recent years, and where consumers go, businesses and politicians do follow. What is vital is not so much COP26, but rather the process, movement and social change that it represents. Humanity has to save itself. It'll be messy and imperfect, but we'll get there. As Boris Johnson said, COP26 could really be a genuine turning point for humanity. Don't forget you can watch everything from past Agenda episodes and find additional exclusive content on our website, cgtn.com/Europe, or on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @CGTN Europe. Coming up on a future agenda, Lebanon's financial crisis. We speak to the governor of that country's central bank, Riyad Salameh. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.